And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge, back once again with another YouTube reading guide series. Today is the first of 7 videos walking through the chronological sequence of Year 1 comics, published by DC. To create this reading guide, I have read the 157 comic issues that have the DC Year 1 branding explicitly on them, and some more besides that, and I've used that knowledge to build the internet's most detailed reading guide of DC Year 1 comics. Now, please note this first video, is the brief introduction video for the series, which sets the scene, provides the terms of reference, and generally explains what we'll be diving into. Now, you might be wondering why I'm doing this video series. Of course, there's lots of other YouTube channels and lots of other YouTube videos that talk about DC Year 1 and Batman Year 1 and things like that. Well, those of you who know my channel will know that one of the guiding principles I use to decide what videos I make is whether the information is already available on the internet. If there's already a guide or an overview of something, then I just refuse to do it because there's no point. That's one of the reasons that I don't do haul videos or overviews or things like that. If I can't add something, I don't just want to create content for the sake of it. So when it came to reading DC Year 1s, I decided I'd be quite interested in learning more about them and reading about the Year 1 branding and so on. And so I went online, did some research, Googled it. And in the case of DC Year 1 comics, if you Google something like list of DC Year 1 comics, the first result you'll get will be an article by CBR.com. In fact, the first couple you'll get will be from CBR.com. So that's comicbookresource.com. The first one was an article listing 10 Year 1 stories in a ranking of their most favorite to least favorite. And the second one was an article, again by CBR.com, listing all the DC Year 1 stories, but it's the same list of 10 in a slightly different order. Now, that was unhelpful and annoying for lots of reasons. Firstly, I don't really like CBR as a website because their output is often riddled with errors and a bit questionable. And in that case, it was just completely unhelpful. For example, when I did it and when I read through, there were actually 24 different Year 1 branded stories. So it would seem that CBR haven't done their research. And so I felt that as I was reading all the Year 1s for my own research, I had an option here to correct this and put out some content onto the internet which explained all this in detail. Now, that's not to say I didn't look elsewhere. I went on lots of other websites, did lots of other research, did a lot of other reading, but there wasn't a single place that actually contained all this information and had a full, complete and total guide or DC Year 1 comics. And so, unfortunately, I felt that I should really document and make a video for it. And that's, of course, what this channel is about. Now, before we get going, just a few things to clear up in this introductory video. Point 1. This specific video series is the start of what I'm going to call my road to DC Rebirth. By that, I mean that this guide is one of several DC guides and series of guides that will incrementally get me closer to the point where I can release my DC Rebirth reading map. I know that sounds complicated and long-winded, but let's be honest, none of the maps on my channel could ever possibly work unless I plan things out in advance and in detail. As such, this series is going to then be followed by several other pretty DC-focused series that get us closer and closer to DC Rebirth. That said, don't worry, there will still be other content dropping here regularly, including my weekly series called Valiant Until the Last, some random overviews, some custom binds I've got coming in, and some Marvel stuff. Point 2. I'm going to be talking through every DC comic that is a Year 1, but I'll be talking about them in a chronological order of release. This is not the same as saying I'll be talking about them when the events happen in the chronology of the DC Universe timeline. I'm not going to be doing that. In other words, if a Year 1 story for one character is set before the Year 1 story for a different character, but was published after that, then I'll be discussing these in publication order, and that's publication order in the real world. I'm doing this as these stories are generally standalone, pretty much at least, and there are some exceptions, but let's leave those for now. I will mention them later when necessary. If you like, I will be providing an overview and some context of each story as I briefly discuss it, so you can always make a note and rearrange this yourself when it comes to your own reading. Point 3. Okay, this is important. This video series is focused on those DC stories that are branded explicitly as Year 1. That does not mean that I'm covering every single origin retelling story or every single story that goes into the first year of a superhero's activity, not by a long way. There are way too many of those sorts of stories out there for me to catalogue. Point four. On that note, given what I just said, it's worth focusing on that point as there's a difference between a year one story, technically, and an origin story. A year one story is technically the first year of a superhero operating as such. Whereas an origin story is what causes a superhero's psychology, so that sort of inciting event. So, for example, an origin story would include Barry Allen losing his mother, or Bruce Wayne's parents being killed. Whereas the year one story for either of them would be Barry Allen getting his powers and running around as the Flash, or Bruce Wayne finally dressing up as a bat and going into the night. I point this out as this clear but subtle distinction is one that many comic authors seem to forget, as the year one branding actually gets misused quite a bit, as we'll see. We'll return to this again and again through the series as I discuss the various year one branded stories. So please remember, I'm discussing stories branded as year one. There will be some here that I personally don't consider year one stories, but are rather origin stories. They'll still be covered as we're talking about branding in particular. Point five. For this series, another important idea I think we need to be very conscious of is the difference between a story that is narrated directly to the reader and one which is told via a flashback, or basically is a character reminiscing. What I found when I was reading this is several stories that are explicitly branded as being year one are actually reminiscent stories like that. And I'll cover them as well, but I am going to call them out as I do feel it's a cheap gimmick for a writer to use. This kind of flashback framing narrative. Some TV episodes use it, some comics use it. And it's like, well, that's fine, it's a flashback, but it's not really a year one per se. So remember, I'm discussing stories branded as year one. Some of them will be reminiscences rather than explicit year ones, but they're still going to be covered. Point number six, I do not have a reading map per se for this series. That's because all of the things I'm talking about are standalone series. There is no complex sequence or interrelationship to show here. Listing them in order of publication is something I found works best. In the very few cases I haven't done that, there's literally one or two things that sort of link together, and you can just make a note of that or just remember that yourself. And last but not least, point seven, I have recently done a video on my channel explaining common comic terminology, like the idea of story arcs and the difference between collector's editions and graphic novels. I'd recommend you watch that if you need any of the terms I use here explained, as this handy flowchart I'm showing you now is one that I made and will talk you through all the things that you need to know in that video. All right, that's the housekeeping out of the way. So with no further ado, let's get into it. What is year one? Well, the year one branding started with the release of the Batman story arc, Batman Year One, written by Frank Miller in 1987. Don't worry, we'll be talking about Batman Year One and its many spin offs in tomorrow's video, which is the first proper video in this series. For now, all we need to know is that the Miller story recounts Batman's first year as a crime fighter, as well as exploring the life of recently transferred Gotham police detective James Gordon. It eventually builds towards their first encounter and their eventual alliance against Gotham's criminal underworld. In other words, the idea of a year one story is a gritty, realistic telling of a superhero's first year operating as that hero. Anyway, the popularity of Frank Miller's work inspired other creators to expand upon the year one concept. Two further stories were published, aptly titled Batman Year 2 and Batman Year 3. Robin and Batgirl have both had their own year one limited series. Nightwing had a six-issue year one story arc within his own title. In 1995, for example, all the DC comic annuals for that year featured a singular year one story. Basically, it just snowballed from there. And in total, there have been 23, arguably 24, stories branded year one published by DC Comics. That's 157 issues. I say that for the purpose of this guide, I'm actually covering all the stories that spin out of year one. So that means that there can be some year two stories, even a year three story, and even a year 100 story. Don't worry, we'll cover them all in this series because I feel they're all kind of thematically branded in the same way. There are a couple of final points to flag, which I'll cover in more depth in the final video in the series. And those are, firstly, one, do not confuse year one with 0 year. I'll explain that in our seventh and final video. Second thing to remember is do not confuse year one with 1 year later. I'll explain that also in our seventh and final video. The reason I'm going to cover them there is that the last video in that series is all about the random miscellaneous series that people mix up with year one tales, so it all kind of goes together. Okay, there we are. And that, ladies, gentlemen, and others, is the end of this introductory video to my DC Year 1 guide series. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.